morning we're in Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 through 27. God works all things together for your good and His glory if you're called according to His purposes. As you turn in there to Joshua 9, I'll just remind you a little bit of where we've been. We're taking the land. These Israelites, since the promise to Abraham and then slavery in Egypt, they've come out of Egypt. Now they were ready to go into the land, except they were frightened because it looked too difficult. Then they wander in the land for 40 years. Finally, they've crossed that Jordan River and they're in the promised land. They took the city of Jericho by marching around it and then shouting on the seventh day. The walls fell. But there was an interesting side story to that Jericho story. There was a woman and her family, Rahab, who were not descendants of Abraham. They were not Israelites. They are Canaanites. They live in Jericho. And because she hid the spies who came into the land, she lied to the kings of Jericho's soldiers so they could be spared. Because of that and her expression of faith in God, they made a peace treaty with her and her family. And so they promised that when they came back and Jericho fell, she and her family would be spared. And in Joshua chapter 6, they kept their word. Then last week we saw an interesting story where actually initially they were defeated because of a man named Achan who was an Israelite. He was part of the tribe of Judah. And yet because of his disobedience to God, he and his whole family were cut off from Israel and completely destroyed. So as we arrive here to Joshua chapter 9, things are getting a little complicated about what actually makes up the people of God. Do you have to be an ethnic Israelite to be part of the people of God? And if your answer is yes, well, it's like, well, Rahab would like to have a word with you. She's not an ethnic Israelite. She is from Canaan, and yet there she is living among the Israelites as if she were an Israelite. Achan, on the other hand, has been completely cut off from Israel, and he had the birth certificate to prove it. He was an Israelite. And so now we start to see that you can be an ethnic Israelite and be excluded from Israel, not be true Israel, and you can be a Gentile and be part of the people of God, even if it comes about by deception. So let's pick up Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, with the threat grows. When all the kings heard about Jericho and Ai, those who were west of the Jordan in the hill country, in the Judean foothills, all along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea toward Lebanon, that is the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, they formed a unified alliance to fight against Joshua and Israel. So after Ai had fallen, and before that Jericho, now you have more of these Canaanites hearing the story of the Israelites and knowing that their day is coming, and there's a great deal of fear. We actually heard that expressed in Joshua chapter 5, verse 1, when all the Amorite kings across the Jordan to the west and all the Canaanite kings near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites until they crossed over. They lost heart, and their courage failed because of the Israelites. It's like their hearts were melting in their chests. Well, now at chapter 9, they've now taken Jericho in addition to crossing the Jordan. They've now taken control of the city of Ai, and the response is, although it doesn't express it as fear, there is the absolute necessity these nations feel to form an alliance so that they can at least have some defense against these Israelites and Israel's God. So the threat is growing against the Israelites. It's no longer going to be the Israelites against Jericho or the Israelites against Ai. It's going to be the Israelites against alliances of nations. But in the midst of that, the Gibeonites practiced deception. Beginning at verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they acted deceptively. They gathered provisions and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They wore old patched sandals on their feet and threadbare clothing on their bodies. Their entire provision of bread was dry and crumbly. They went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We've come from a distant land. please make a treaty with us. Actually, they're from just over the hill. From where I'm from, they're just from the next holler over. It's like less than 20 miles from this camp at Gilgal to where the 4 Gibeonite cities exist. But they say, we've come from a distant land, please make a treaty with us. And the men of Israel replied to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us. How can we make a treaty with you? And they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Then Joshua asked them, who are you and where do you come from? And they replied to him, your servants have come from a faraway land because of the reputation of the Lord your God. We have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the 2 Amorite kings beyond the Jordan, King Sihon of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan, who was in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our land told us, take provisions with you for the journey, go and meet them and say, we are your servants. Please make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we took it from our houses as food on the day we left to come to you. Look now, it's dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new and we filled them, but look, they are old and cracked. And these clothes and sandals of ours are worn out from the long journey. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but did not seek the Lord's decision. So Joshua established peace with them and made a treaty to let them live, and the leaders of the community swore an oath to them. So these nations have come together to form an alliance against the Israelites, but there's this one group of city-states. They're part of the Hivites. The cities are known as Gibeon, and there's 4 of them. They've decided not to practice war, but to practice deception. And when they show up, they look the part. It's like they're putting on a show. They say, look at these sacks that we have on our donkey, they're worn out. And look at this bread, it was warm when we left home, and now it's moldy and dry and crumbly. And look at our garments, these sandals were white, new, when we left, but look at them now. They're worn out. Look at our garments, we've had to patch them. Our wineskins were brand new, and now they're old and cracked. They give every appearance that they've come from a distant land. And they're asking then the Israelites to make a peace treaty with them. And it's interesting, the exchange that they have with the Israelites and with Joshua. The men of Israel said, maybe you've come from far away. Maybe you're trying to deceive us. It's like they're suspicious. They're on to them. They said, we're your servants. And then Joshua says, he's feeling the same way. Who are you? Where do you come from? And then they give this, we're from far away. And then they make certain claims about Israel's God. They also use the name Yahweh. They refer to the Exodus event. They refer to Moses' destruction of the kings Sihon and Og that was just on the other side of the Jordan River. Does that sound familiar? If you were here when we did Joshua chapter 2 and Rahab's conversation with those 2 spies, that's exactly what she said to them. She said, I hid you because we heard of your God, the Yahweh, and our hearts melted in our chests. We heard about what he did for you. Now, their confession is not quite as strong as hers. They don't say, we believe your Lord is the true Lord God in heaven and on earth, but it's pretty close. And they, like Rahab, are asking for a peace vow, a treaty, a covenant. Make a covenant with us, make a treaty with us. When they answer, we are your servants, it sounds like they know a couple of things. First, they know about Jericho. We know that from 9:1, when all the kings heard about Jericho. So we already know they've heard about what happened at Jericho. They don't mention Rahab, but don't you think they probably also heard about Rahab, a Canaanite who was spared at Jericho? And I'm sure they would have inquired, well, how was she saved? Well, because she claimed to believe in their God and she knew some things about them. She mentioned some things God had done for them, and so they show up with the same plan. They might also know Deuteronomy chapter 20. Now, they wouldn't have had the law, but it seems suspicious that their response is, we are your servants. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, starting at verse 10, this is where Moses is telling the Israelites about how they're going to react to these nations that they're going to end up coming against. What's our responsibility when we come against some other nation, whether in Canaan or outside of the promised land? So in Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 15, he discusses here what their responsibility is for nations that do not live in Canaan. So he says in verse 10, when you approach a city to fight against it, make an offer of peace. If it accepts your offer of peace and opens its gates to you, all the people found in it will become forced laborers for you and serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you but wages war, lay siege to it. And then go down to verse 15. This is how you're to treat all the cities that are far away from you and not among the cities of Canaan. So they've been given instructions that if you encounter city-states, nations that are not part of the promised land, they do not live in Canaan, you don't have a responsibility to utterly destroy them. In fact, you can make a peace treaty with them and they can become your servants. So the Gibeonites show up and they say, we're from far away, we're not from Canaan, and we will be your servants. Please make a peace treaty with us. I mean, they've got all the facts right. They know what they're doing. This is a brilliant ruse. This is a great deception. And yet, the Israelites and Joshua seem a little suspicious. And they're asking questions. And yet the response is, nope, look at this bread, look at our clothes, look at our sandals, look at our wineskins. Nope, we've come from a long way away. And we finally get down to the decision in verse 14. The men of Israel took some of their provisions, but did not seek the Lord's decision. They did not seek the Lord's will, and so they make a treaty with them. They take a vow that we will not destroy you. You can live among us, and we will have peace with you. And at this moment, Joshua and the Israelites have made a fundamental mistake, a tragic error. They have violated the teaching of Deuteronomy because they did not seek the Lord's will. It makes it sound like that Joshua and the Israelites needed a healthy dose of James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, which says, come now, you who say, we'll go here and we'll go there, we'll go to this city, we'll stay for a year, we'll do business, we'll make money. And he says, James says, but you don't know your life, what it will be, so you should say, if the Lord wills, we will go here or we will go there. And if the Lord wills, we will stay for a certain period of time. And if the Lord wills, we'll do business there. If the Lord wills. It's a compact little teaching that says, do not plan without God. Don't draw up your plans. Don't make decisions in life without working in light of the will of God. Don't put together your plan and then ask God to make it right, to ask God to put his stamp of approval on it. It doesn't work that way. And we are sure to make bad decisions if we make decisions apart from the Lord's will. I had an aunt. She was actually my grandmother's sister. Her name was Gwen. I called her Aunt Gwen. She was my grandmother's sister. She lived in the same town we did. I was very close to my grandmother, so I was close to her sisters too. These were godly women, and my Aunt Gwen stands out to me particularly for a couple of reasons. One, she believed the King James Version of the Bible was the only true Bible. And as I started to branch out, you know, she didn't know the word woke, but when I became woke by like reading other translations, she just couldn't believe it. And I can't put my hand on a Bible and swear that she said this, but as I stand here today, I can hear her saying, it was good enough for Peter and Paul, it's good enough for me. Like they were reading an English Bible. That's one thing that stands out about my Aunt Gwen. The other thing that stands out is she would just use the phrase, if the Lord's will, on any future matter that was going to involve her. Like, I'm going to make hamburgers for lunch if the Lord wills. I'm going to go to the grocery store later today if the Lord wills. I'm going to watch Walter Cronkite on the evening news tonight if the Lord wills. Everything was if the Lord wills. And it, you just came to expect it, and you basically would kind of stop hearing it because she said it so often. And I thought it was a little bit silly and awkward, as a young kid. But as I stand here today, and I hear Joshua and the Israelites making a decision like this, apart from the Lord's will, they needed a little bit of my Aunt Gwen there to say, now wait a minute, you've got suspicions, you've not done any investigation, you've not prayed, you got priests standing around with Urim and Thummim in their garment. You could grab those and toss them like dice and it would come up, casting the lot. Yes, do this, or no, don't do this. But they did none of that. He just made the call, okay, we'll make a treaty with you. And it looks like a tragic mistake. And that's where that part of the story ends. So Joshua established peace with them and made a treaty to let them live, and the leaders of the community swore an oath to them. They've been bamboozled, hoodwinked, deceived, and we would expect disaster to follow. And then finally, Gibeon's deception is exposed. Verses 16 through 27. 3 days after making the treaty with them, they heard that the Gibeonites were their neighbors living among them. They're just from over the hill, not too far away. So the Israelites set out and reached the Gibeonite cities on that third day, and now their cities were Gibeon, Shaphrah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the community had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and then the whole community grumbled against the leaders. And all the leaders answered them, we have sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. This is how we will treat them. We will let them live so that no wrath will fall on us because of the oath we swore to them. They also said, let them live. So the Gibeonites became woodcutters and water carriers for the whole community as they had promised. And Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said to them, why did you deceive us by telling us you live far away from us, when in fact you live among us? Therefore you are cursed and will always be enslaved, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God. The Gibeonites answered him, it was clearly communicated to your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. We greatly feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. Now we are in your hands. Do to us whatever you think is right. And this is what Joshua did to them. He rescued them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. On that day, he made them woodcutters and water carriers, as they are today, for the community and for the Lord's altar at the place that he would choose. It only took 3 days. 3 days to know what a tragic mistake Joshua had led the Israelites to make. They had made a peace treaty with a city of pagans in Canaan. Now, they seem to be willing to acknowledge Israel's God, but they still are worshipers of other deities, at least up to this point in time. And this is against the law. This is contrary to what God had commanded them, and anybody can see the danger now that exists. If they allow more and more Canaanites to remain in the land, they're going to corrupt Israel's worship. They're going to corrupt Israel's theology. That's why God said they must be removed completely. And so the people grumble. For the first time we've heard since Joshua took over, verse 18 at the end, then the whole community grumbled against the leaders. Now, we've heard them grumble before. They grumbled frequently against Moses, and in almost every case, I'm like, come on, people. Moses is doing a great job. He's led you out of Egypt. He's pled to God on your behalf. He's done so much. He speaks to God. Follow him, trust him. And yet, the first sign of trouble, they grumble, they complain. Here, their grumbling's justified. They've been misled by their leaders. Their leaders did not do their due diligence. They did not investigate the situation. They did not cast the lots. They did not even pray. And so now they have made a peace treaty with Canaanites who will now live just over the hill. But they will be their servants. And that's in keeping with Deuteronomy 20, that if you make a peace treaty with them, they will serve you. But the language of serving them is interesting. He says in verse 21, they will be woodcutters and water carriers for the whole community. That sounds like secular servants. But then at the end of verse 23, and water carriers for the house of my God. So actually it looks like they're going to serve around the temple. Now they won't be priests and they won't be in the holy place, but water is necessary. Now there's no temple yet. This is the tabernacle. This is the tent of meeting. But they still need lots of water there for the ritual washing, for ritual purification. And they're going to be the ones who bring the water. They're going to be close to the holy place. I mean, they were well aware, these Gibeonites, that these Israelites should have destroyed them completely. And they knew that. And so they came up with this ruse. And the Israelites made a peace vow with them. Now, for us, we're here in this story. I'd think maybe Joshua would file a lawsuit against them and say, you lied, you were deceptive, and get that vow overturned. Let's get this contract overturned. Let's take this to court. You lied to us. Doesn't work like that in ancient Israel. If you make a vow, if you swear an oath, then you are bound to it. It's like a sacred vow. And they had made this vow before the Lord. So they can't just say, well, you tricked us, so all bets are off. They are duty bound. We've seen the strength of taking a vow in Israel. We will see it in the next book, Judges chapter 11. There's a man named Jephthah who's one of the 12 judges. He's going to lead Israel against the Ammonites. And God has already told him, my spirit is with you, I've given you the victory, and yet he still needs more affirmation. And so the last thing he does before going off to battle is, he makes an oath to the Lord. He says, if you give me the victory, I will sacrifice the first living thing that comes out of my house when I arrive back. Now, I'm certain he did not plan that first living thing would be his daughter. And it was. And at that point, we would kind of expect Jephthah to say, now, hang on here. I know you're not a God of child sacrifice. So let me use an animal of some type. But not my daughter. But there's none of that. He knows he's made this vow. Now that his daughter's the first out, he gives her a couple of months to spend time with her friends, to mourn her coming death and the fact that she won't have children. She'll have no successors. And then he takes her life as a living sacrifice to God. And it makes us, it doesn't sound right. But I'll remind you that he shows up in Hebrews 11 as one of the heroes of the faith. Keeping that vow that he made was a sacred obligation. If Israel just goes around breaking the vows, not keeping their vows before God, they show themselves to be people who are not trustworthy. They show themselves to be people who are not fully honest people. God's moving them towards letting their yes be yes and their no be no. So once you've taken a vow, you are bound to it. It's a sacred obligation. So the wise course would be to not make stupid vows. And yet, Genesis 44, when those brothers of Joseph are going to Egypt because of the famine, and they're showing up and having to ask their brother Joseph that they'd sold into slavery, can they have some grain? And he knows who they are, but they don't know who he is. And he sends them back to his father. He wants them to bring his father back. He has all good intentions, but he's testing them out a little bit to check on their integrity, to see if they would care for now their younger brother, because they tried to kill him. He was their next to youngest brother. They killed him, so Benjamin's still their youngest brother. He's the last of Jacob's sons. So he puts his gold cup in Benjamin's bag, his pack, as they leave, unbeknownst to any of his brothers. And then he sends his servant after them, saying, one of them stole my cup. So when the servants get there, they say, one of you stole the second in command's cup. The brothers say, oh no, it was not us. And they swear a vow. And here's the vow. With whoever of your servants the cup be found, let him die, and we will become my Lord's servants. And then they start digging, and there it is in Benjamin's bag. Now, luckily, Joseph had no intention of letting them follow through with that vow, but that's the only reason. It was another foolish vow. And it's the kind of thing that human beings do if they do not seek the Lord's will in making important decisions. There are interesting parallels here between Rahab and the Gibeonites. I already pointed to some of them. Like the Gibeonites, Rahab was a native of Canaan. Like the Gibeonites, she had confidence that Israel's God was going to give them this land. Like the Gibeonites, she responded in fear before God's people. And like the Gibeonites, she acted in cunning. She lied about having the spies in her roof. They lied about where they were from in order to preserve her and her family's lives. They also both made confessions of faith in Yahweh, Israel's God. But these parallels are not just coincidental. It reveals a fundamental tension in the story. Who makes up the people of God? Who are the people of God? We might say Israel, they were God's chosen people. They are the people of God. Well, I would agree with that, but you have to also understand that now Rahab's part of the people of God. She's part of the Israelite community. Achan is not. So it involves more than simply your ethnicity. You can't pull out your birth certificate, and if it shows you're a certain ethnicity, it makes you part of the people of God. It's never been about that. Even Israelites could fail to be part of Israel. Look at Achan. Paul makes the same argument in Galatians chapter 4. He argues that a Gentile who believes that Jesus is the Messiah is more a descendant of Abraham than a Jewish person ethnically who rejects Jesus as Messiah. The tension in this story forces us to ask the question, who makes up the people of God? And already, God is beginning to do his great work in the creation where his people will not be defined ultimately by ethnicity, but by faith in Jesus. And he starts that plan with the promise to Abraham that I'm going to make a great nation out of you in this great land, and you will be a blessing to all nations. It's the gospel before the gospel's preached in the New Testament. And the strangest thing God does in Joshua 9, he's keeping that promise that Israel will be a blessing to all nations, namely here the Gibeonites, even though they practiced deception. Joshua might not have known James's teaching about if the Lord wills, but it sounds like he's learning something about Romans chapter 8, verse 28. That God works all things together for the good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose, and for God's glory. God is doing his work in the world despite their bad decision. That's the nature of the God we serve. We live in a world of imperfections. We live in a fallen world. We live in a world where things hardly ever go as we wish they would go. And yet, God is working his purposes out in an imperfect world, making it ultimately perfect again. In an imperfect world, human beings make bad decisions. We go off on our own and we don't ask if the Lord wills. We make decisions about relationships. We make dating decisions. We make decisions about where we're going to college and careers. We make decisions about houses and cars without consulting God, without trying to understand what is the Lord's will in this thing. And as a result, we often find ourselves in a mess. Here's the good news. Even in our messes, God can bring something good for us and something that glorifies him. And to that I say, thanks be to God.